So I don't know if you've ever looked at life and said, what a mess. I have. I've done things in my life. I think, man, I really made a mess of that. And then sometimes not just a mess. Decisions that I made or choices that I make, even after being in the mess, seem to make it worse. And it's what I call a hot mess. And it's something actually that we refer to, man, what a hot mess. Actually, Webster has a definition for a hot mess. It says someone or something that is emphatically a mess. It's in a state of extreme disarray or disorder. And that's what we're looking at today. In Genesis chapter 16, we find that Abram and Sarai are creating a hot mess. I want to start reading at verse 1. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And so she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, 'You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me.'" Just before we get into the narrative of this text, we need to connect with how it was written, because this passage is actually written in a unique way. The writer, under God's direction, appears to intentionally demonstrate an interdependence between Genesis 16 and Genesis chapter 3, the chapter that we refer to as the fall. The verbs are very similar, the structure is very similar, and it ties these things together so that the reader, when they're reading it, would go back, as they're reading this in Genesis 16, would go back to Genesis 3 in their mind. And I'm just going to give you 4 examples of what I mean here. In Genesis chapter 16, 2a, it says, "So she said to Abram." In Genesis 3, it says, "The woman said to," referring to Adam. In Genesis 16b, it says that Abram agreed to what Sarai said. And Genesis 3:17 says, "You listened to your wife." In Genesis 16:3a, it says Sarai took her Egyptian slave. And in Genesis 3:6a, referring to Eve, it says that she took some fruit. Genesis 16:3b, it says, "and gave to her husband." And the end of Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, it says, "She gave to her husband." This ties it all together, and I think it's important to know that this section here in Genesis chapter 16 really is a tie-in to what happened in Genesis chapter 3. And we know there's no bigger mess in all of human history than the choice to sin that resulted in every person having a broken relationship with God. The structure in the writing ties all these things together, and so we need to remember this is a huge, huge event. This is a big mess. It's a hot mess that we're into now. Not as hot as Genesis 3. Nothing will compare to that, but very significant mess that we're talking about today. So we want to walk through this knowing that there's this big mess going on. But we're going to look at it through the participant's eyes. So we're going to start with Sarah. It begins with her. There in verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children." She was still childless. She was struggling with that. And actually, it says this, it says that the Lord has kept me from having children, which sounds very similar to what we read last week in Genesis 15:3, when Abram said this, "You have given me no children." They didn't understand what was going on, and in our humanity, when we don't understand, we tend to move to blame right away. especially blaming God. It's easy to blame God when we don't think things are going well. And we need to remember that. Oftentimes we go to the place, just like Sarah went to the place, do you care, God? Do you really care? Last week we talked about the fact that when it's quiet, it seems like God's not there, and we're saying, God, where are you? And we're very much in that same place with Sarah today. Where are you? God, it's your fault. You haven't given me children. And actually, she was right. God didn't give her children. He actually was not letting her get pregnant, but for a reason that she didn't know. And actually, in this time of struggle, when she wasn't having children, she didn't let that event draw her closer to God, bring her closer to God, make her more reliant on God. She became upset with God. She blamed God. Yes, he wasn't letting her have children, but it was for a completely different reason. That God wasn't letting her have kids, and she didn't know that, and so it didn't make sense to her. How are we going to fulfill a promise? It was a promise that God made, but I think Sarah's kind of second guessing. You know, Abram, he made the promise that you were going to be the father, but he hasn't said that I'm going to be the mother. Maybe it's someone else who's going to be the mother of that promised heir. Or maybe we need to figure something else. And so she did. She thought of a way to do this that was actually legal and proper in the world at the time. I can't really blame her for feeling that. After 10 years of waiting, I find it very hard to wait at a stoplight when there's no traffic. Sarai has been waiting 10 years at her kind of traffic light. But it was more than just losing patience. I think there's something else going on here. When we read the text, we realize that Sarah wasn't upset that she wasn't having children because God's promise wasn't being fulfilled, or because Abram wasn't having the son that he wanted to have. She actually was upset because of her own standing in people's eyes. Because having children was so significant and so important. If you weren't having children, that you were looked down upon in that society, and she didn't like that feeling. She was uncomfortable with that feeling, and she was trying to figure out, how do I get out of this uncomfortable place? She was thinking about herself and having that people look at her in a diminished way. And so she schemes another way. She tells Abram, have sex with my Egyptian slave so that she can have a baby and so that I can build a family from her. Here's what we learn. That faith is living without scheming. You see, Sarah was not living at faith at the time. She was trying to scheme to get something, and so faith is living without scheming. Trust and true faith to live without scheming to gain the promises of God. Somehow we think God still needs our help along the way, but he doesn't need our help. He's never needed our help, but Sarah isn't there. Now, hear me, I'm not really knocking Sarah, because that's humanity. We struggle with the same thing so many times. We try and make things work in a way that maybe God hasn't planned because we're losing patience or we're uncomfortable, and so we move in a direction not knowing whether it's right or not. So that's Sarah, but Abram has obviously a huge, significant part to play in this story. It really starts at the end of verse 2 when it says, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Abram was part of the scheme. Sarai thought about it, and somewhere along the way she talked about it with her husband, and Abram says, yeah, that makes sense, let's do it. Abram was 85 years old. He knew that Sarah's womb was as good as dead. And so he's thinking, I'm 85. How, God, are we going to get this promised heir? There's got to be something that's going on here that we don't know about. And so they're starting to think, what are ways that we can do this? And so Sarai comes up with this scheme, and Abram says, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it. And you know what? It worked. Hagar got pregnant. You know what? If things work out in the end, we think it must have been the right thing to do. It worked. Sometimes I talk with people and I say, so how did you come to this conclusion? And this is the idea that I had. And I talk to these people and you know, a lot of people agree with me, these people that are important in my life. And so it must be the right thing to do. Or I wasn't sure what to do, but it worked out. You know, it came to fruition. But those are not the criteria for doing what's right. This actually was legal. There's nothing wrong according to the marriage ceremony or the marriage laws of the day. But they didn't make it right. Just because it's legal doesn't make it right. Just because people agree doesn't make it right. And hot messes often come when we think we understand and we figured out a way to do it, but they often come when we don't really understand and we aren't willing to trust and follow the instructions. It's hard. If it doesn't feel right, we tend to do something else to make us feel like, oh, that's more comfortable. And so we make a decision based on our comfort. But remember, way back when we started this series, I said, you know, when it's in the place of discomfort where our faith grows. But so often we chase after being comfortable. I remember the first time I changed oil in my car. My family are mechanical. We do these things. The first time that I did it, I got under the car. I drained the oil. I took the old filter off. I did everything that I needed to do. I put the new filter on, and I did. I looked at just to make sure I do this right. It says, you know, just tighten it a little bit, and once the connection is made, maybe do another. I think it was like a half turn of the filter. I did that, and I thought, you know, that doesn't feel good enough, and so I tightened it a little bit more. Actually, probably a bit more. And, you know, it was great. Put the oil in, drove it, and then I came to the next time that I had to change the oil. And anybody who's changed the oil already knows the end of this story. Got under the car, drained the oil, went to take the filter off. I could not get that filter off. I wasn't thinking when I put the oil filter on before that, you know, this oil is going to heat up and the seal is going to expand and it's going to be warm, and so it's going to be tight. I was just thinking I need to tighten it. So I actually am underneath the car for I don't know how long. I'm struggling. I'm fighting with this. I'm trying to get this filter to budge, to come off. I can't get it. I get frustrated, obviously, and it's just like, what do? I go talk to my dad, and my dad comes out and he tries, and he's always really good at these kind of things. He couldn't get it to budge either, and so we talked to one of my brothers, and he gave us an idea, and finally we got the thing off. But honestly, I made a huge mess, something that should have been an easy thing to do. I made it really difficult, a hot mess, so to speak, just because I wasn't willing to trust and follow the instructions. That's where Sarah and Abram are. They had instructions, but it didn't feel comfortable, and so they did something else, and they actually created a hot mess that we live with today. But we want to think not just about Abram and Sarai in this event, because Hagar is there. Hagar is the slave. I just want to read verses 4 to 6. It says this: He slept with Hagar, she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms. Now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her what you think best. And then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. I've heard a number of sermons about this growing up and even studying it. And when I look at it and when I heard those sermons, people often referred to Hagar. Once she knew she was pregnant, and yes, she despised Sarai, that Hagar was arrogant and she was proud and she was, really sassy and that she just, basically was saying, ha, Sarah, I'm better than you. I can get pregnant. You can't. And she kind of threw that in her face. And I'm not sure that is the whole story. That might maybe be part of it, but I think there's another part. Let me throw to you another scenario. See, the word slave actually suggests that she was a young slave, possibly a virgin. And remember, she was from Egypt, so she probably was acquired by Sarai from Abram and Sarai when they were in Egypt, and Sarai was with Pharaoh. So there's this Egyptian slave, probably young, possibly a virgin, and her owner, her mistress, says, Hagar, you have to have sex with my husband, who is 85 years old. It wasn't her choice. She didn't have a voice. She didn't get to vote. It wasn't that Sarai went to her and say, hey, are you willing to do this? I need a surrogate womb in some ways. That's what this was really all about. I need a surrogate womb. Are you willing to do that? It wasn't asked. It was forced upon her. It wasn't her choice. So maybe instead of being arrogant and pride, she was hurt and she was angry and she was in pain. She was pregnant. She didn't want to be pregnant. She was treated as if she were a non-person. Another translation of that word despise could be disdain. She actually was living in disdain because she was forced to do something that she didn't choose to do. And so she maybe verbally, went at Sarai. I don't know, but Sarai felt that disdain. She knew it was there. And Sarai says she couldn't handle the treatment from Hagar. She couldn't handle whatever it was that Hagar was doing to her. And she just was so upset that she actually just harassed Hagar. To the point where Hagar couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't handle that, and so she decided to run away. But think about this. Hagar was forced to have sex, and Sarai was so upset of the outcome of that, of how Hagar treated her. And so she went to Abram and said, what do I do? And Abram says, do what you want. Think about that. I mean, Abram, in my mind, stooped a little bit lower. He says to Sarai, this is what Sarah say, this is what's going on. And Abram says, do what you want. She's your slave. He didn't refer to Hagar as my wife. He didn't care for his wife. He didn't even say, hey, that's my child that is growing inside of her. He didn't even protect his unborn child. You see, he abdicated his responsibility. You see, scheming comes at a price. And in this case, I think that Abram's integrity took a hit. Hagar runs away, and then this is an incredible change of scene in the story. We're at the awe-inspiring thing here. Hagar is running away, and the angel of the Lord shows up. God shows himself to this lowly Egyptian slave girl. And it reminds me that God's watchful eye, that no one is beneath God's watchful eye or his gracious care. Genesis 16, verse 9, it says, "And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her.' And the angel added, 'I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery.'" Go back? Like, the angel of the Lord is saying to Hagar, go back to that awful place, that place where you felt so hurt, so painful, so everything. Go back. She did. He gave a promise. She went back. I don't know what that going back was. I don't know if Sarai, graciously accepted her back. I don't know if Hagar went back in humility. It doesn't tell us, but it does tell us that she went back. But what's really cool here is this Egyptian slave girl gave a name to God. She is the first human being to give a name to God. El Roi is what the Hebrew says. It says, "The God who sees me." She was hurt. She was mistreated. She was treated like an object. She was angry. She was in pain, and she was in turmoil. And yet God shows up in her life and says, "I'm here. I'm with you. You're not alone." And God gave her this promise. And so she went back, but she went back with the knowledge that God saw her. And she carried that in her heart, that she was not alone, that God was looking out for her. And so we need to look and how do we apply this to our lives? There's a hot mess going on, but there are a lot of things that we can do. First, I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know if you're in a hot mess in your life or right now if life seems to be going along fairly well. I do know that we have a lot of misery in our world. There's a lot of struggles going on. There's financial problems for people. There's mental health issues for people. There's the fear, of going out or contracting COVID or there's not, and it's not just COVID, there's so many other parts of life as well. I don't know where you are, but God does. This is what I know. I know that God sees you. If it's true of this lowly Egyptian slave girl who is running away, it's true of me and of you. God sees us. I know that faith is living without scheming. I know that we can trust God while we are in an uncomfortable season of life. It's in that uncomfortable season, remember, that faith grows. God sees you. It doesn't matter how bad the mess is, how hot the mess is, God is still there. This is a hot mess. From Hagar and Ishmael actually is where the Arab nations come from, where Isaac and Abraham and Sarah's offspring is the Jewish nation. And there's been this infighting ever since. But God is there, and God is on the move. And you can trust Him in the hot mess. So the challenge today is, how can we live in faith and not try and scheme to get out of the uncomfortable place when God wants to build our faith? Because this is something I do know, and I think I can say with a great deal of confidence. What you're learning in the mess today, in that uncomfortable place, will set you up as you grow in faith to deal with the next hot mess that comes in our lives, because our humanity always has a mess on the horizon. So let's trust God and believe that He sees us no matter what is going on in our lives.